Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruhu wa nu'minu bihi wa natawakkalu alayhi wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina. Man yahdillahu fala mudilla lahu wa man yudlilhu fala hadiya lahu. Wa nashhadu anna sayyidina wa nabiyyina wa maulana Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Sallallahu tabaraka wa ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa baraka wa sallama tasliman kathira. Amma ba'd, fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. A couple of weeks ago, when we last had the lesson, I touched on the topic of inheritance in Islam. And I mentioned before Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam how the Arabs, how the people of Mecca in particular dealt or were when it came to distributing the estate and the property of the deceased. And I gave a story of a very famous companion in the name of Hazrat Sa'd bin Rabi radhiyallahu anhu, who was martyred during the Battle of Uhud. So it was mentioned that when Hazrat Sa'd radhiyallahu anhu was martyred, then his brother took the entire property, and he had 2 daughters and he had a wife. And because the culture or the practice in those days were that daughters and women in particular don't have a share, don't have a right in the inheritance, so what the uncle of the daughters did, what the uncle of Hazrat Sa'd, Hazrat Sa'd anhu's brother did, was that he took the entire property and he did not give anything to the daughters, and he did not give anything to Hazrat Sa'd anhu's wife. And because of which the ayat and the verse about inheritance was revealed. And I also mentioned the severity of not complying with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's orders when it comes to inheritance law. And there is a very beautiful hadith where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, this hadith can be found in Sunan ibn Majah, that a man and a woman for 60 years. Now 60 years which is mentioned in the hadith is obviously, generally speaking, a man or a woman lived to 60. But it doesn't have to be 60 years, it could be 70 years, it could be 50 years, or it could be 30 years when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees their death. So the hadith explains that a man and a woman, they are in Allah's obedience for 60 years. And 60 years ke baad, what happens? When they are about to die, they do a bit of zulm when it comes into the inheritance. They don't give their sons the right shares. Or as is the culture in some families, the sons will take everything but the daughters get nothing. So what does that husband do? What does that father do? What does that person do? He does a bit of zulm when it comes to the inheritance. Jiski wajah se, as the hadith says, Jahannam becomes wajib upon him. So this is something which is very, very severe. And I gave this example before, that many brothers and sisters, the entire life they spend in worship, obedience with topi, with beard, first saf in namaz, all the namazis with jamaat, with congregation. But then when it comes to inheritance, they go around the bend slightly. They try to look for loopholes. They try to do a bit of like tricking, a bit of deception, a bit of plotting here and there with one son or with one daughter, or giving preference to one son over the other. So they've done a bit of zulm. Jiski wajah se, what happens is that Jahannam becomes wajib and obligatory. So these were the themes which I touched on a couple of weeks ago, and also the week before when we had that particular lesson. Now in today's lesson, I want to talk about making wills. And in particular, the importance of making wills in this day and age, and in particular in this country. And I'll explain the reason why it is important. I did mention this topic briefly last time, but I'm going to look at this in a bit more detail in today's lesson. Now, the first verse to be revealed about wills in Islam is this verse which can be found in Surah Baqarah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمْ إِذَا حَضَرَ أَحَدَكُمُ الْمَوْتِ إِن تَرَكَ خَيْرًا الْوَصِيَّةِ, which means that when somebody is about to pass away, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that you have to make a will. Now, at the very beginning of Islam, there weren't any laws about what a husband gets when his wife passes away, what a wife gets when her husband passes away. There weren't any laws about how much a father will get, how much a mother will get. There weren't any laws about how much a son will get, how much a daughter will get. But at the very beginning of Islam, the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was similar to the law of this country. In other words, before you pass away, write a will, and in this will, make sure you give something to lil walidain, to your parents, wal aqrabin, and to your relatives. So like it happens in this country, that when you pass away, people write wills that, okay, £100 to this such and such a person, or £1,000 to my first son, £2,000 to my second son, £5,000 to the first daughter, and then they distribute their estate. Like they write out a will, this person will get this much, my wife will get this much, father will get this much. So exactly the same, that was the procedure at the very beginning of Islam. When somebody, before he passes away, that person had to write that Fula ke liye this much, such and such a person ke liye this much, the wife will get this much, son will get this much, daughter will get this much. So that was the rule at the very beginning of Islam. So at the very beginning of Islam, writing wills was considered to be something wajib and something obligatory. Thereafterwards, the verse about inheritance was revealed, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly says that husbands will get this much, wives will get this much, sons will get this much, daughters will get this much. So the miras, i.e. the taqseem of how much the husband will get, how much the wife will get, how much the children, the sons and the daughters will get, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He Himself has distributed, has given the ratio. So now this verse here in Surah Baqarah, where He talked about writing wills before you pass away, there was no need for this verse anymore. Because look, because Allah had already said, before there wasn't any laws from Allah. It was, you write a will before you pass away, and you yourself decide how much you want to give. But then obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then, obviously Allah knew this from before, but obviously when you start letting people decide how much they should give to their sons and to their daughters, as you can imagine, there will be some kind of zulm. There will be some kind of oppression where one son will get more than the other son. Or sometimes sons will get it, daughters won't get it. Sometimes the wife will get everything and the parents don't get anything. So obviously people then started committing a bit of zulm, started oppressing. Very similar to the laws of talaq in Islam, that at the very beginning, as mentioned in a hadith, that 3 talaqs was considered to be 1 talaq during Prophet's time, during Hazrat Abu Bakr time. But then during Hazrat Umar's time, when he saw people started taking advantage, in other words, they would give their wives 3 talaq, and then they would say, oh no, I just only meant 1. So what did Hazrat Umar do? He then decreed, or he then gave a verdict that no, from now on, 3 talaqs is considered to be 3 talaqs. So exactly here, that initially it was left up to the deceased before he passes away. You decide how much you want to give. But unfortunately, people then started taking advantage. So therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself then said, no, okay, because you're taking advantage, because you're committing zulm and oppression in the shares and in the taqseem of how much this person should get, how much this woman should get, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself then decided the ratio. That husband will get this much, wives will get this much, sons will get this much, daughters will get this much. So this ayat in Surah Baqarah, it's not abrogated, we still act upon it. So the Sharia says that, okay, it's not obligatory anymore to write a will, but it's desirable and mustahab to write a will for those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not given them a share. So those people who Allah hasn't decreed a share for, such as, like for example, husbands, wives, sons, daughters, sisters, brothers, their share Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given. But those rishtadar, those relatives, like say for example khala, or say for example aunties or poopies and so on, who are kind of distant relatives, but Allah hasn't given them a share. So what this ayat is telling us is that before you pass away, and if you have some extra money and you have say a distant poopy or a distant khala who themselves are muhtaj and are poor, then what you could do is that you could just write a share for them. Just say, okay, I give my distant poopy living in Pakistan, living in India, £100, and from your inheritance it will be given to her. Or I give my distant cousin brother this much amount of money, then you can write that in the share. So let me just give you a recap of what I just said. So basically at the beginning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala left the distributing of the property into hands of the owners, in the hands of the deceased before he passes away. But obviously people then started doing a bit of zulm and oppression. Women weren't getting it, daughters weren't getting it. So therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the verse, and Allah himself now decides the ratio, how much the person will get, how much the son will get, how much the daughters will get, how much the husbands will get, how much the wife will get. But this verse, which I just recited from Surah Baqarah, we still act upon it. In other words, it is still recommended to make a will, khas taur par, for those relatives who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by obligation is not giving a share, but because they are distant relatives and they may be muhtaj and poor, you should still give it to them, so that they who are poor, they who are muhtaj, then they could obviously look after themselves. So that in a nutshell is the order of inheritance and writing wills in Islam. Now the rules which I mentioned, that applies more in an Islamic state. And in this country, so in an Islamic state, writing wills is considered to be more mustahab and desirable. But in this country, or in any Western countries, or any country where Sharia law is not being practiced, where they are not, when you pass away, they're not going to enforce Islamic inheritance law, then in those countries, writing out a will is not mustahab anymore, but it now becomes wajib. It now becomes obligatory. Now keep this in mind. It's mustahab in an Islamic country. Why is it mustahab in an Islamic country? Because when you live in an Islamic country, you have no problems. Because when you pass away, the Islamic courts are going to distribute your property according to the Quran and the Sunnah, i.e. according to Allah's laws. Because they're Muslims, they're going to distribute it according to what Allah has said in the Quran. But in an un-Islamic country, or in a country where Islamic Sharia law or inheritance law is not being enforced, so when you pass away, what happens is that if you haven't written a will, or if you haven't made a will in according to the law of this country, your estate or property is called intestacy. Like it's called intestate. You've got intestate property. And what does intestacy mean? Intestacy basically means where you passed away without writing a will. Now what happens when you pass away when you don't write a will? The law of this country will give the entire property to your wife. If you have no children, everything will go to your wife. And if you have children, then your wife will take half and the remaining will go to the children. So do you know your parents, if they were alive, they also had a share of your property as well. They're not gonna get anything. If you had brothers and sisters, they also had a right in your property as well. but according to the law of this country, they're not going to get anything. So what happens is, so I'll give you an example. Just say somebody passes away and you've got no children, your wife will take everything. Or if the wife passes away and no children, the husband takes everything. Halake, the Quran says that if the wife passes away, husband can take half, and if the husband passes away, then the wife will take a quarter if there are no children. But what does the law of this country say? The wife or the civil partner, they take everything. Now that is totally against the teaching of the Quran, the teaching of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Totally against that hadith I explained, where for 60 years, 70 years, that brother, that musalli, was obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his namaz, in his roza, in his zakat, in his sadaqat, in his hajj, in his muamalat, in halal and haram. But then before he passes away, because he didn't do the wills properly, what happened? His property now is being distributed according to the law of the country. So in other words, you have now become a sabab, a cause for giving your property, all of it to your wife, and the rest of your relatives like parents, brothers, sisters, who had a haqq and a right on that, they don't get anything. So you then get in trouble. Not in this country, you're not going to get in trouble in this country, but you're going to get in trouble in the hereafter when you are in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will question you for all your a'mal, for all your deeds. Because remember, as Allah says in the Holy Quran, that on that day, يُغَادْ صَغِيرَةً وَلَا كَبِيرَةً إِلَّا أَحْصَاهَا, which means that your little deeds, your big deeds, everything will be in the book of deeds, in the Namai A'mal. So there's no getting away from it. So as I was saying, that if you don't write a will, then this is what will happen to you. So you pass away and you'll see that your property, everything's being distributed un-Islamically. And then you'll be questioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter. And remember, you can't use excuses in those days in front of Allah. Oh Allah, oh, we were living in the UK. They had, non-Islamic laws here. You can't say to Allah, I was living in a Western country and, they don't practice Sharia law. That's not an excuse in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So keep this in mind, that if you don't have a will, then your property is going to be distributed un-Islamically. Now the only way you can save yourself, Muslims can save themselves from committing zulm, oppression, by making sure that their parents, their brothers, sisters, their wives, their children, everyone gets a right share, and what they're entitled to is by drawing up a will. You do a will. Obviously, Islamically, the will can be done orally, but it's best to do it in writing, so that then there's no ikhtilaf between sons, daughters, children after your death. So you write out the will, and in this will, obviously, there's two ways of doing it. Either you could download it from internet sites and so on, but it's best not to, because when you download it from internet, you're not sure where you're getting the information from. You're not sure whether they're reliable, whether they're not reliable. Sometimes what could happen is that you've got some certain, properties, certain estates, may not be in this country, maybe in another country. So now obviously when you download a form from the internet, they're not going to tell you all that, how to distribute that. So it's always best that either, you book an appointment with a solicitor, alright, they may charge you a bit, £30, £40, £50. If it's a Muslim solicitor who's doing Islamic wills, then they may do a bit cheap. But obviously book an appointment, obviously speak to them, tell them that, look, these are my assets and so on, and I want a will ready. Now in the will, this is like standards, but obviously different solicitors may do wills in different ways. But in that will, what will be mentioned is that obviously when you pass away, you want firstly your property to be used for your tajheez and takfeen, i.e. for your kafan, for your burial costs. Thereafterwards, you will stipulate in your will that afterwards I want my money or my estate to be used to pay off any debts which I have. And thereafterwards, you'll then mention that I want my property to be distributed in the following way. In the following way, i.e. following way say murad, i.e. Islamically. So what you'll write on the will, but again as I said, every solicitor may do it differently, but what you'll write on the will is that, okay, if I pass away, I've got two sons. So Islamically, two sons, if there's daughters involved, they get double than what the daughter gets. So you write that down. Or like for example, my mother's alive, so Islamically when a person passes away, the mother gets 1/6 of the property. So you write that down. My mother, I want you to take 1/6 of the property. Or like my father's alive, I want him to take 1/6 of the property, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran. So istara, those siblings, sons, daughters who are alive, accordingly you will distribute the property. Now after you've done that, you then sign the will, and then obviously the solicitor who you've done the will with, they'll keep a copy. You will also keep a copy as well. And obviously, Khuda na khasta, when obviously if you were to pass away soon, then obviously your family members will then be able to use the will. The solicitor will be able to use that will. And remember that will, when it's been done properly, signed, everything, and it's with the solicitor, is considered to be a legal document. It's a murad, in other words, you could show this document to the council and they won't touch your property. They won't do anything to your property, because if you obviously don't have that, then what will happen? They'll take your property, they'll distribute it. Obviously, if you are the owner of a house, they will actually take that house from your wife and they'll distribute it, unless obviously you could do something about it, unless you could say, well, you could get your wife's name into the house and so on. But generally speaking, whatever estates you have, in particular land, in particular businesses, they'll just take it and they'll distribute it. So it's very, very important that we set this out, we do it, because obviously we don't know when death is going to come. It could come tomorrow, it could come next week, well, it could come whenever. But ask yourself this question, that if death was to come tomorrow, even tonight, have we prepared ourselves with the will? Yeah, have we prepared ourselves? Obviously, many of us will be thinking we haven't even prepared ourselves in namaz and other things, but okay, that's also important as well. We should always be constant and regular in our prayers and our ma'amalats and ibadat. But also ask yourself, are we ready with regards to our wills as well? Are we ready that if we were to pass away now, all the land which I own, all the money which I have, who's it going to go to? Is it going to be distributed Islamically? Or is it going to be distributed un-Islamically? Jiski wajah said, then I'll be thrown into hell and I'll be punished further in the hellfire. So you need to ask yourself these questions. And you need to obviously think about making, because obviously sometimes brothers, they do have intentions that yes, Mufti Saab or Mawlana Saab, yes, we'll do the will Monday morning. So we have that jazba, we have that kind of zeal and shauq to do it. But then what happens is that we don't then carry it out. And the brothers, we always have intention to do good deeds. When we listen to bayans, when we listen to ta'aleem, or when we listen to a bayan from a tabligh sati, and they encourage brothers to go for 4 months. We have intentions, for 40 days, we have intentions, but very few of us do it. So don't just make it like, okay, I've made the intention, but then forget about it. No, make the intention, and then obviously, think about booking an appointment, think about, doing a particular Islamic will, because it only takes around 20 minutes, 30 minutes, it may cost 30, 40 pounds, but that's nothing if it means that we are able to save ourselves from the punishment of the hereafter. And just very quickly, one other point I want to mention, was mentioned by some satis when I came a couple of weeks ago, about when we distribute the property, can we distribute the property during our lifetime? In other words, somebody's reached 60, 70, misal ke taur par, he knows that he's on borrowed times, if that makes sense. He knows that, next few years, obviously Allah knows best, but he knows that he's reaching the end of the tunnel. So what does he do? He then distributes the property in his lifetime. Because I'm going to pass away in the next few years. So I've got a couple of houses here. I might as well distribute it to my sons and daughters, and I'll move to Pakistan, and move to India, I'll move to Medina Munawwara, and then I'll pass away there peacefully. So now the question is that, can you distribute property during your lifetime? Now I was mentioning to the satis, but obviously mentioning it to everyone now, is that remember, when you distribute property during your lifetime, it's not considered to be inheritance. Inheritance is something which happens after your death. After you leave this world, that's when rules of miras and inheritance applies. What you distribute when you are alive is considered to be hibah, is considered to be a gift. Now the qanun or the rule with regards to gift is that everyone is equal. Sons, daughters are equal. Remember this carefully. When you pass away, sons get double than what the daughter gets. So when you pass away, fair enough, your son will get, let's say if you left behind £30,000 and you left behind a son and a daughter, son will get 20,000, daughter will get 10,000. That is after you pass away. But when you are alive and you've got £30,000 on you and you want to now distribute it amongst your children, then you have to be equal. Son will get 15, daughter will get 15. So just keep this usul or rule in mind that any property you distribute in your lifetime, that is not considered to be inheritance. That is considered to be hibah, that is considered to be gift. And the qanun when it comes to gifts is that everyone is equal. Whether you got 10 sons and whether your youngest son is like only 10 years old, even then he's got the same right and haqq as your eldest son who may be 40 years old. So everyone is equal when it comes to gifts. But obviously when it comes to inheritance, remember inheritance is after you pass away. After you leave this world, that is inheritance. So obviously for inheritance, that's when obviously husbands will get half if there's no children. Wives get quarter if there are no children. Parents get 1/6, brothers get a share. That ratio, or sons getting double than what the daughter gets, that is when you pass away and leave this world and you let the Sharia distribute your property. But if you are distributing your property, or you're thinking about distributing property, or you've distributed your property in your life, then make sure that everyone is equal. Children are equal. If you want to give something to your parents, give them equally as well. Brothers, sisters, if you want to give them, just say if you don't have children, but you want to give it to your brothers and sisters, then again, don't just give it to brothers and forget about your sisters. You also have to give it equally to everyone. So remember, any property which is distributed in your lifetime, there has to be musawat, equality, barabari. But obviously after you pass away, that's when inheritance rules apply. That's when obviously sons will get double, brothers will get double. That's when everyone gets a particular share and a particular portion. So just a conclusion or recap today's talk or dars, just obviously talking about wills. And as I was mentioning that even though in Islam it is considered to be mustahab or desirable to make a will, but according to the zamana we are in, according to the country we are living in, making out an Islamic will is something which is wajib, obligatory. Why? Because if we don't and we were to pass away, then our property will be distributed un-Islamically. And the last point I just mentioned is that if we do decide to distribute our property before we pass away, then remember the rules of inheritance doesn't apply. In other words, what will happen is that you have to distribute the property in terms of you giving your children a gift, and the qanun and the rule when it comes to gifts are everyone is equal. Now just one point I want to mention about the wills before I finish. Obviously I was also saying that when you draw up the will, you write how much your son or your daughter gets, or you write how much you want your son to get Islamically, how much your parents to get. Now what could obviously happen is, before you pass away, one of the wuratha, they pass away before you. Just say for example, you wrote on your will that okay, I want my father to get this much amount of money, my mother to get this much, my son to get this much, my daughter to get this much. You wrote that in your will. But what could happen is that before you pass away, your father passes away. Before you pass away, your son passes away. Now, what happens in Islam is that when one person passes away, do you know the shares of everyone, it totally now becomes different. Badal chata, you need to make a new will now. Because obviously, do you know what your father was supposed to get? Because of him passing away, it will now be distributed to the others. Or what could happen is that somebody else who weren't receiving inheritance, they may now come into the picture. And they'll get a share, but obviously less than what the father was getting. So what happens is that the total hisab now and the calculation changes. So in that situation, what you'll have to do is that you probably have to draw out another will again. So if somebody was to pass away before you, and because of that reason the entire calculation and hisab changed, so what you'll have to do is that you probably have to make another will. and that will keep on happening obviously before, if somebody was to pass away, before you pass away. But obviously if you pass away, then obviously whatever you mention in your will, that will be acted upon. Because as I was saying, that a will, it's a legal document in this country, so whatever it says in the will, it will be carried out. So may Allah give us the tawfiq to act on what's been said. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillah.